To understand why public executions became so popular, we need to step into the shoes of people living 300 to 500 years ago. Life was dramatically different from today. First, imagine a world without Netflix, YouTube, concerts, sports stadiums, or even books for most people. The majority of the population couldn't read or write. Your entertainment options were incredibly limited, maybe some folk music at the local tavern, religious festivals a few times a year, or traveling performers who might visit your town once or twice annually. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes like today. It was part of daily life. Children died young from diseases we can easily cure now. People died from infected cuts, childbirth complications, or simple accidents. The average person had seen more dead bodies by age 20 than most of us will see in our entire lives. People lived in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Major events brought the whole community together because shared experiences were rare and precious. When something big happened, it became the talk of the town for months. Most people believed deeply in heaven, hell, and divine justice. They saw public executions as moral lessons, watching sinners face God's judgment through earthly justice. It wasn't just entertainment, it was considered educational and spiritually important. Against this backdrop, public executions became the perfect storm of entertainment. They were free, dramatic, morally instructive, and brought entire communities together. They filled a massive gap in people's lives, the need for excitement and shared experience. Let's dive into the peak period of execution entertainment, roughly from 1500 to 1800, when these events reached their most elaborate and popular form. Execution days were announced weeks in advance, like advertising a major concert today. The whole city would buzz with anticipation. People would plan their schedules around it, arrange childcare, and even travel from neighboring towns to attend. On execution morning, the atmosphere was electric. Street vendors set up early, selling everything from meat pies to commemorative pamphlets. Taverns opened their doors before dawn. People claimed the best viewing spots hours before the main event. The show began long before reaching the gallows. Condemned prisoners were loaded into carts at the jail and paraded through the city streets. This wasn't just transportation, it was the opening act of the entertainment. The procession moved slowly, allowing maximum interaction between the crowd and the condemned. People would throw rotten vegetables, shout insults, or sometimes show sympathy. The prisoners often played their part, either maintaining dignity, begging for mercy, or defiantly cursing their fate. In London, the route from Newgate Prison to Tyburn Gallows became so famous it spawned lasting phrases in English. Gone West originally meant heading to Tyburn to die. The journey typically included stops at taverns, where condemned prisoners were allowed final drinks, sometimes so many that they could barely stand for their own execution. These weren't quiet, respectful gatherings. Execution crowds were loud, rowdy, and highly interactive. They had expectations and standards for how things should go. A good death meant the condemned person showed courage, accepted their fate, and perhaps delivered a moral speech warning others away from crime. The crowd would cheer and show approval. A bad death, begging, crying, or protesting innocence, would result in jeers and mockery. The crowd also policed the execution itself. If the hangman was incompetent or cruel beyond accepted standards, the mob might turn violent. There are records of crowds attacking executioners who bungled their job or seemed to take too much pleasure in causing suffering. Some condemned prisoners became genuine celebrities. Notorious criminals drew the biggest crowds and generated the most excitement. Their final words were recorded and sold as pamphlets. Their crimes were turned into ballads and folk songs. Jack Sheppard, an 18th-century English thief, became such a popular figure that his execution in 1724 drew over 200,000 spectators, roughly one-third of London's entire population at the time. People camped out overnight to secure viewing positions. Public executions generated serious money. Entrepreneurs rented out windows and balconies overlooking execution sites. Chair rentals were big business. Food and drink vendors could make a month's income in a single day. Some locations built permanent scaffolding around their execution sites, with different price tiers for viewing. The best seats cost significant money, while the poor crowded together in the free-standing areas. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of public executions to modern minds is how family-friendly they were considered. Parents regularly brought children as young as 5 or 6 years old to watch people die violently. This wasn't considered inappropriate or traumatic, it was seen as essential education. Parents viewed executions as powerful teaching tools. They believed children needed to see the consequences of sin and crime with their own eyes. A public execution was worth 1,000 sermons about right and wrong. Religious leaders actively encouraged family attendance. They argued that witnessing divine justice in action would make children more moral and law-abiding. The shock and fear of seeing someone die for their crimes was considered beneficial character development. Beyond moral instruction, executions taught practical lessons about authority and social order. Children learned who held power in society and what happened to those who challenged it. It was civic education through terror. Parents would point out specific lessons: see what happens when you steal, or, that's why you must obey the law. The dramatic, unforgettable nature of execution made these lessons stick in ways that simple lectures never could. Attending executions together created shared family memories and strengthened community bonds. Families would discuss what they witnessed for years afterward. It became part of their collective story and identity. Children who attended the same execution would have a common reference point throughout their lives. It was similar to how shared cultural experiences, like watching the same TV shows or movies, bond people today. Regular exposure to public death served to desensitize people to violence, which was considered necessary for survival in a harsh world. Life was violent and unpredictable. Parents believed sheltering children from death's reality would leave them unprepared for adult life. For many families, attending your first execution marked a transition toward adulthood. It was proof you were mature enough to handle serious, adult realities. Some communities had informal traditions around what age children should first attend executions. Despite the grim subject matter, execution days had genuine festive elements. Families packed elaborate lunches and made day-long outings of the experience. The combination of serious moral instruction and social celebration created a unique atmosphere that satisfied multiple needs simultaneously. To truly understand public execution's popularity, we need to explore the psychological forces that drew people to these events. The appeal went far deeper than simple bloodthirst or cruelty. Humans have always been simultaneously terrified of and fascinated by death. Public executions allowed people to confront mortality in a controlled, safe environment. They could experience the thrill of witnessing death while knowing they themselves were secure. This psychological phenomenon still exists today in our fascination with horror movies, true crime documentaries, and disaster footage. The difference is that our ancestors had fewer outlets for this natural curiosity. Witnessing dramatic events together creates powerful social bonds. Modern research shows that people who experience intense emotions together, whether positive or negative, form stronger connections than those who share mundane experiences. Public executions provided communities with shared intense experiences that strengthened social fabric. Everyone who attended had something profound in common, creating lasting bonds and conversation topics. Psychologists call this survivor guilt, in reverse, the relief and even joy that comes from witnessing someone else's misfortune while remaining safe yourself. Watching executions reinforced attendees' sense of their own survival and good fortune. This psychological boost was particularly important in an era when life was precarious and death could come suddenly. Seeing others die while you lived another day provided genuine psychological comfort. Watching criminals receive their punishment satisfied deep human needs for justice and moral order. Attendees could feel morally superior to the condemned while simultaneously feeling that the universe was just and orderly. In a world where bad things often happen to good people for no apparent reason, public executions provided clear examples of cosmic justice, bad people receiving appropriate punishment. Even while supporting the execution, crowds were simultaneously breaking social norms by celebrating death and violence. This created a thrilling sense of controlled transgression, being slightly naughty while remaining on the right side of law and morality. Public executions provided emotional release for communities dealing with the stress and frustration of daily life. The crowd could express emotions, anger, excitement, bloodlust, that were normally suppressed in polite society. Executions followed predictable patterns that gave them ritualistic power. Like religious ceremonies, they provided structure, meaning, and a sense of participating in something larger than individual experience. Not all public executions were created equal. Different methods of execution provided different types of entertainment, and audiences had distinct preferences based on what kind of spectacle they wanted to witness. Hanging was by far the most common method, especially in England and America. It struck the perfect balance between drama and efficiency. When done correctly, death came relatively quickly, but there was still enough struggle and spectacle to satisfy the crowd. The drop method, where the condemned fell through a trapdoor, wasn't invented until the 1760s. Before that, victims were slowly strangled as they were hoisted up, creating a longer, more dramatic death that crowds found more entertaining. Hangings also allowed for last-minute drama. Sometimes the rope would break, and the condemned person would survive the first attempt. Crowds would debate whether this was divine intervention requiring a pardon, or simply bad luck requiring a second attempt. Beheadings, common in France and other parts of Europe, offered different entertainment value. The drama was intense but brief. The moment of the axe falling created incredible tension followed by immediate, shocking resolution. Beheadings were considered more honorable deaths, typically reserved for nobility or political prisoners. This added an element of class drama that crowds found fascinating, watching powerful people brought low. The efficiency of the guillotine, introduced during the French Revolution, actually reduced some of the entertainment value. Deaths were so quick and clean that they lacked the struggle and drama that made hangings more engaging for spectators. Burning was reserved for the most serious crimes, heresy, witchcraft, and treason. These executions could last for hours and drew the largest crowds because they offered the most dramatic spectacle. The condemned person's behavior during burning was carefully observed. Screaming and begging were expected and even enjoyed by some spectators. Maintaining dignity or praying throughout the ordeal would sometimes generate sympathy from the crowd. However, burning was often modified to be less entertaining but more merciful. Executioners would sometimes strangle victims before lighting the fire, or place gunpowder around the condemned to cause quicker death. Crowds often protested these merciful modifications because they reduced the spectacle. Reserved for high treason, drawing and quartering involved hanging the victim until nearly dead, then disemboweling them while still alive, and finally cutting the body into quarters. It was rare but drew enormous crowds when it occurred. The complexity and duration of this method created extended drama. Each stage of the punishment provided different entertainment value, making it the ultimate execution spectacle. Different cultures developed their own execution entertainment traditions. Spanish auto de fe combined religious ceremony with execution, creating elaborate theatrical productions. Some cultures included torture before execution, extending the entertainment value. In some places, condemned prisoners were allowed to fight for their lives in gladiatorial-style combat, adding elements of sport to the execution process. Some public executions became legendary events that drew unprecedented crowds and generated lasting cultural impact. The beheading of King Charles I of England outside the Banqueting House in London was perhaps the most shocking execution in British history. It wasn't just entertainment, it was revolution. Thousands of people crowded into Whitehall to witness the unprecedented sight of a king being executed by his own subjects. The psychological impact was enormous. If even kings weren't safe from execution, traditional authority structures were truly shattered. The execution was carefully choreographed for maximum political impact. Charles was allowed to make a final speech defending his actions and maintaining his innocence. When the axe fell, witnesses described an audible groan from the crowd, a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and fear. The execution of Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution drew massive crowds eager to see the former queen meet her fate. The guillotine had made executions faster and more efficient, but the symbolic power remained enormous. Marie Antoinette's execution was particularly dramatic because of her behavior. She maintained royal dignity throughout the process, refusing to show fear or beg for mercy. This impressed many spectators who had expected to see her broken and humiliated. The crowd's reaction was complex, celebration mixed with unease. Even revolutionaries who supported her execution were somewhat awed by witnessing the death of someone who had once held such power. The execution of Frederick and Maria Manning for murder drew one of the largest crowds in British execution history. An estimated 50,000 people filled the streets around Horsemonger Lane Jail. What made this execution particularly notable was the presence of Charles Dickens, who was so disturbed by the carnival atmosphere that he wrote passionate letters to newspapers condemning public executions. His eyewitness account of the crowd's behavior helped turn public opinion against the practice. Dickens described the scene as wickedly festive, noting how spectators treated the execution like entertainment while showing no solemnity for the loss of human life. His influential voice helped accelerate the movement toward private executions. Jack Sheppard's execution drew an estimated 200,000 spectators, roughly one-third of London's entire population. Sheppard had become famous for his daring prison escapes and Robin Hood-like reputation. The crowd that gathered for his execution was so large it caused London's first recorded traffic jam. People climbed buildings, hung from windows, and perched in trees for better views. The atmosphere was more like a royal celebration than a criminal punishment. Sheppard played his part perfectly, maintaining courage and dignity while delivering moral speeches about the dangers of crime. His execution generated ballads, pamphlets, and stories that circulated for generations. Robert François Damiens attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France and received one of history's most elaborate execution spectacles. He was tortured with hot pincers, had molten lead poured into his wounds, and was finally pulled apart by horses. The execution lasted for hours, during which Damiens remained conscious and even conversational. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some were entertained by the spectacle, while others were horrified by the excessive cruelty. This execution became famous for marking a turning point in public attitudes toward extreme punishment. Even spectators who supported execution began questioning whether such extreme torture was necessary or moral. The final public executions in various countries became significant cultural events. In France, the last public guillotining in 1939 drew such massive, unruly crowds that the government immediately moved all future executions behind prison walls. In America, the last public execution in 1936 similarly drew crowds whose behavior embarrassed officials and accelerated the move toward private executions. Public executions weren't just social events, they were significant economic opportunities that generated substantial money for various entrepreneurs and businesses. Execution days were like modern-day Super Bowl events for local economies. Hotels filled with out-of-town visitors, restaurants ran out of food, and retailers saw massive spikes in sales. Innkeepers would raise their prices dramatically for execution weeks. Some establishments specialized in execution tourism, offering package deals that included lodging, meals, and premium viewing locations. The best viewing locations commanded high prices. Building owners near execution sites would rent out windows, balconies, and rooftops. Some constructed temporary scaffolding with tiered seating like modern sports stadiums. Prices varied based on view quality and proximity to the action. The most expensive seats offered clear, close views of the entire proceedings. Cheaper options might only show parts of the execution or require standing in crowded areas. Some entrepreneurs built permanent structures around regular execution sites, creating the world's first death theaters, with different price tiers for different levels of comfort and visibility. Food vendors could make weeks' worth of income in a single execution day. They sold everything from simple bread and cheese to elaborate meat pies and pastries. Alcohol was particularly popular, both for courage and celebration. Smart vendors positioned themselves along the procession route and around the execution site. The best spots were claimed hours before events began, leading to a secondary market in vendor locations. Special execution-themed foods became popular. Jack Ketch's Kitchen sold gallows cakes and hangman's bread. These weren't considered morbid, they were festive-themed treats. The souvenir industry around executions was surprisingly sophisticated. Vendors sold execution pamphlets with details about the crimes and criminals, often illustrated with dramatic woodcuts. Pieces of the hangman's rope were particularly prized souvenirs, supposedly bringing good luck. Real rope pieces commanded high prices, leading to a thriving market in fake rope fragments. Some vendors sold last words pamphlets supposedly containing the condemned person's final statements, though many of these were fictional accounts written to satisfy public demand. Skilled executioners became celebrities in their own right, commanding higher fees and drawing larger crowds. They developed signature techniques and theatrical flourishes that enhanced the entertainment value. Some executioners published memoirs or gave interviews about their work. They were invited to social events and treated as notable public figures rather than social outcasts. The most famous executioners could negotiate contracts with different jurisdictions, traveling to wherever they could command the highest fees for major executions. People would travel significant distances to attend famous executions, creating an early form of dark tourism. This required infrastructure, transportation, lodging, and services for visitors. Some cities actively promoted their executions as tourist attractions, recognizing the economic benefits of drawing large crowds. They would advertise upcoming executions in neighboring towns and cities. As public executions moved behind prison walls, this entire economy disappeared almost overnight. Businesses that had relied on execution crowds struggled to find alternative revenue sources. The economic impact of ending public executions was significant enough that some communities resisted the change purely for financial reasons, regardless of moral considerations. By the 19th century, attitudes toward public executions began shifting dramatically. What had been considered normal family entertainment for centuries suddenly seemed barbaric and inappropriate. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human dignity, justice, and the purpose of punishment. Philosophers argued that the goal of justice should be deterrence and rehabilitation, not entertainment and revenge. Religious attitudes also evolved. While earlier Christianity had supported public executions as moral instruction, newer theological thinking emphasized mercy, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Growing literacy meant more people were reading newspapers, books, and pamphlets that criticized the brutality and circus atmosphere of public executions. Influential writers and social reformers began actively campaigning against public executions. Charles Dickens' eyewitness account of the Mannings execution was particularly influential in turning public opinion. Reformers argued that public executions corrupted spectators rather than educating them. They pointed to the drunkenness, violence, and immoral behavior that often accompanied execution crowds as evidence that these events were socially harmful. Medical professionals added their voices, arguing that exposing children to violent death was psychologically damaging rather than educationally beneficial. The transition to private executions happened gradually and unevenly across different countries and regions. Some places maintained public executions well into the 20th century. Private executions were typically conducted within prison walls with only a small number of official witnesses present. This eliminated the entertainment aspect while maintaining the deterrent effect through newspaper coverage. The change wasn't universally popular. Many people felt that private executions reduced the moral and deterrent value of capital punishment. Some argued that if society was going to kill people, it should do so openly rather than hiding the act. As executions moved behind prison walls, newspaper coverage became more important. Detailed written accounts replaced direct observation, changing how the public experienced and understood executions. Some newspapers provided extremely graphic descriptions of private executions, attempting to maintain the vicarious thrill that public executions had provided. Others took more restrained approaches, focusing on justice rather than spectacle. The final public executions in various countries became significant cultural moments marking the end of an era. These events often drew larger crowds than usual, as people recognized they were witnessing the end of a centuries-old tradition. In France, the 1939 public execution of Eugene Weidmann drew such massive, unruly crowds that officials immediately decided all future executions would be private. The behavior of spectators, fighting, drinking, and treating the event like a party, convinced authorities that public executions had become incompatible with modern civilization. Even after public executions ended, their cultural impact lingered. Phrases, traditions, and attitudes shaped by centuries of execution entertainment remained embedded in language and culture. The sites of famous executions often became tourist attractions in their own right, allowing people to experience a diluted version of the historical spectacle through guided tours and historical reenactments. The story of public executions as family entertainment reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and society that remain relevant today. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson is how social acceptance can normalize almost any behavior. For centuries, bringing children to watch people die violently was considered not just acceptable but morally necessary. This shows how powerful social norms can be in shaping what we consider normal or abnormal. This has modern parallels in how different societies normalize different levels of violence, whether in entertainment, politics, or daily life. What seems obviously wrong to us might seem perfectly normal to people in different contexts. The human fascination with violence didn't disappear when public executions ended, it simply found new outlets. Modern horror movies, violent video games, true crime documentaries, and viral disaster footage serve similar psychological functions to public executions. The difference is that we've largely separated entertainment violence from real violence, creating fictional or historical alternatives that satisfy our psychological needs without actual harm. Public executions served important social functions beyond mere entertainment. They created shared experiences, reinforced community values, and provided outlets for emotions that otherwise had few acceptable expressions. Modern society still seeks these functions through other means. Sports events, concerts, political rallies, and social media movements all serve similar community-building purposes. The transition away from public executions shows that moral progress is possible. Practices that seemed normal and necessary to our ancestors now appear obviously wrong to us. This suggests that some of our current practices might similarly appall future generations. While we can condemn the practice of public executions, understanding why they were popular helps us better understand human psychology and social dynamics. Our ancestors weren't monsters, they were people responding to their circumstances with the tools and understanding available to them. The reformers who ended public executions succeeded by questioning long-standing traditions and authorities. They asked whether practices that had continued for centuries were actually beneficial or necessary. This reminds us to question our own assumptions and traditions, asking whether they serve good purposes or simply continue because that's how things have always been done. The story of public executions as entertainment is ultimately a story about us, human beings trying to make sense of life, death, justice, and community in the best ways we know how. While their methods now seem horrific, the underlying human needs they addressed, for meaning, connection, justice, and understanding, remain universal. By studying this dark chapter of history, we better understand both how far we've come and how much work remains in creating more humane, just, and compassionate societies. The crowds that once gathered at Tyburn and other execution sites weren't fundamentally different from us. They were people seeking meaning, entertainment, and community in their lives. Understanding their choices helps us make better choices in our own time, when the stakes of human dignity and social justice remain just as high as they ever were.